You're looking at a real city. It had a name. It had streets, churches, schools, kids who grew up playing on those sidewalks, and right now, none of it exists on any map. Not because it burned down, not because an earthquake swallowed it, because somebody decided it shouldn't exist anymore, and then made that happen. What we're about to go through isn't a list of abandoned places. Abandoned implies something passive, something accidental. These cities weren't left behind. They were removed. And the difference between those two things matters more than most people ever stop to consider. 10 cities, 10 decisions. And by the end, you'll find yourself looking at maps a little differently, wondering not just what's there, but what used to be there, and why it isn't anymore. There's a town in the New River Gorge where the post office still operates. One road in, one road out, no bridge connecting it to the rest of the state. Population, at last count, 5 people. 100 years ago, Thurmond was one of the busiest railroad towns in all of Appalachia. Coal money was pouring through here. The Dunglin Hotel hosted gambling, drinking, and deals that shaped the regional economy for decades. The C&O Railway made Thurmond its own kind of crossroads. At its peak, this town processed more freight than Cincinnati. Then the coal industry started shifting. Diesel replaced steam. Trucks replaced rails. One by one, the reasons to stay evaporated. Not dramatically, not in a single night, but slowly, like water draining from a bathtub you forgot to watch. What's strange about Thurmond is that it didn't fully collapse. It just stopped. The buildings are still there. The train depot still stands, maintained by the National Park Service now, which tells you something about how a place transitions from living community to historical exhibit without anyone really deciding that's what should happen. Nobody forced the people out. But the structure that made staying possible was systematically removed. That's a quieter kind of erasure, but it's still erasure. What we're about to see gets a lot less quiet. In 1893, they found gold in the Superstition Mountains east of Phoenix, and within months, a town materialized from the desert floor like a fever dream. Saloons, a general store, a stamp mill, hundreds of men who believed they were standing at the beginning of something permanent. By 1898, the vein had run dry. Goldfield was gone almost as fast as it appeared. Here's the part that catches me. Goldfield didn't disappear. It came back, twice actually, once in 1910 and again in the 1920s, whenever someone thought they'd found another pocket of ore. Each time, hope built it back up. Each time, reality knocked it down again. What exists there now is a reconstruction, a tourist attraction built on the ruins of something that was already a reconstruction. You can tour the mine, watch a staged gunfight, eat at a restaurant designed to look like the 1890s. The town that was real became a performance of itself. There's something worth sitting with in that. Some places get erased by force. Others get erased by becoming a simulation of what they used to be. And nobody can quite say which version is more gone. In 1962, a fire started in a mine seam beneath Centralia. Nobody is entirely sure how, possibly from a trash burn that got out of control, possibly from something older, something that had been smoldering for years without anyone knowing. What's certain is this: they couldn't put it out. They tried. For years, they tried. The fire spread through the coal veins underground, following seams that ran in every direction beneath the town like a hidden nervous system catching flame. By the 1980s, sinkholes were opening in backyards. Carbon monoxide was seeping into basements. A 12-year-old boy nearly fell into a steam vent that had opened without warning in the ground beneath his feet. The state and federal government eventually bought out most of the properties. The residents left. The buildings came down. Then the government did something strange. They officially removed Centralia's zip code. They took it off the postal maps, as if removing the address could remove the fact that people had lived there. About 1,000 people once called this place home. Now a handful remain, holding out in a legal dispute with the state over the right to stay in their own homes. The roads are cracked. The intersections have no reason to exist. And if you walk the right path on a cold morning, you'll still see smoke rising from the ground, not from a fire that's raging, but from something that refuses, after 60 years, to go out. The Mojave Desert doesn't preserve things so much as it suspends them. Heat and dryness slow the normal processes of decay, which is why, in the middle of nowhere, an hour outside Las Vegas, you can still find the walls of a 3-story bank building standing in the open air, 70 miles from the nearest city. Rhyolite appeared in 1904 after a gold strike in the Bullfrog Hills. Within 3 years, it had 8,000 residents, a school, an opera house, an ice cream parlor, a stock exchange, and, most improbably, a house built almost entirely from glass bottles set in adobe mortar, constructed by a miner named Tom Kelly, supposedly to win a bet. The bottle house still stands. The bank walls still stand. But by 1916, rhyolite was functionally dead. The gold hadn't lasted, the railroad pulled out, and the investors who'd poured money into this desert dream moved on to the next one. What's unusual here isn't the collapse, it's the architecture of what remained. Rhyolite didn't rust or rot the way most places do. It became skeletal, in a weirdly elegant way, its bones exposed not in ruin, but in a kind of arrested stillness, like the desert itself refused to finish what the abandonment started. The next place on this list was also swallowed, but not by desertion, by water, and by deliberate government action. In 1938, the Bureau of Reclamation gave the residents of St. Thomas, Nevada, 30 days to leave. The Hoover Dam was filling Lake Mead, and the math was simple and brutal. The town sat at an elevation of 1,220 feet. The lake was going to rise above that. The town would go underwater. St. Thomas had been there since 1865. Mormon settlers had built it, farmed it, raised families in it for over 70 years. They had a school, a post office, a general store. The last resident, a man named Hugh Lord, reportedly sat on the porch of his home watching the water rise until it reached his front steps, then rowed away in a boat. For decades, St. Thomas existed only in memory and in the historical record. Then, in 2002, a severe drought began dropping Lake Mead's water levels. The ruins of the town started emerging. Foundations, the old road, fragments of walls, not restored, just uncovered, returned. Every time there's a drought severe enough, St. Thomas comes back. It's been described as a ghost town with a seasonal schedule, visible in dry years, submerged in wet ones. There's something almost unbearable about that image. A community that surfaces and disappears according to the weather, unable to stay gone, unable to fully return. What happened to St. Thomas was at least acknowledged. The government bought the land, paid people to leave, treated it as the necessary cost of a larger project. What happened to the next place on this list was framed very differently, and the consequences were left entirely to the people who had to live inside them. Lead and zinc mining made Peacher, Oklahoma, one of the most productive mining districts in American history. For decades, the ore that came out of this corner of the Midwest supplied bullets for 2 world wars. The town was considered essential, patriotic even. What nobody was telling residents, for a long time, what some of the people in a position to know actively concealed, was what all that mining was doing to the ground, the water, and the children. The waste from the mines, called chat, accumulated in massive gray piles visible for miles around. It contained lead. It leached into the groundwater. Kids played on those piles. The dust blew through town. By the time serious testing was done in the 1990s, the results were catastrophic. A third of the children in Peacher had elevated blood lead levels. Lead poisoning at those concentrations causes irreversible cognitive damage. It lowers IQ. It affects behavior. It follows a child for the rest of their life. In 2008, the government declared Peacher uninhabitable and began a federally funded buyout. The buildings were demolished. The school, which had served the community for generations, was torn down. The chat piles remain. The contamination remains. Nobody was ever prosecuted. By 2013, Peacher had 10 residents. Officially, the government considers the matter resolved. The children who grew up breathing that dust, drinking that water, have a different view. In 1955, a small Idaho town called Atomic City became the first municipality in the United States to be powered entirely by nuclear energy. It was a milestone. Proof that the atomic age wasn't just about weapons, that the technology could light homes and run refrigerators and make coffee in the morning. The government promoted it heavily. Atomic City was a symbol. 6 years later, in January 1961, there was an accident at the experimental reactor just outside of town. 3 workers were killed, the only fatal nuclear reactor accident in American history, a fact that remains surprisingly little known. The details of what exactly happened that night, and what was done in the immediate aftermath, were not made fully public for years. The town didn't evacuate overnight. It declined slowly as the workers and their families who'd been drawn there by the reactor project drifted away, and nothing came to replace them. The nuclear dream didn't extend to Atomic City itself. The reactor site still exists, still classified under federal jurisdiction, monitored but not discussed in any particular detail. Atomic City today has fewer than 30 residents. It's technically still incorporated. You can drive through it in about 90 seconds. The water tower still has the name painted on it. Whether that counts as a city or just the idea of one is a question nobody seems interested in officially answering. In 1825, a small group of African American New Yorkers purchased land in the middle of Manhattan, land that, at the time, was well outside the developed city. They built homes. They built churches, 3 of them. They established a school. They put down roots in a city that had not historically made room for people like them to put down roots. At its height, Seneca Village had around 250 residents, most of them black, with some Irish and German immigrants as well. It was one of the few places in antebellum New York where black Americans could own property outright, and property ownership at that time was directly tied to the right to vote under New York state law. Seneca Village wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a mechanism for political participation. In 1857, the city of New York used eminent domain to seize the land. The plan, Central Park, the residents were given what the city called fair compensation, though records suggest the amounts were far below market value, and given very little time to relocate. Some resisted legally. They lost. The park was built. The village disappeared beneath the landscape. For over a century, its existence was almost entirely absent from mainstream histories of New York. When archaeologists began excavating sections of Central Park in the 1990s, they found the physical evidence of what had been there. Foundations, artifacts, the remnants of daily life. What they'd uncovered wasn't just a historical site, it was a deliberate omission, finally made visible. Next time you walk through the park's northwest corner, around 82nd Street, you're walking on top of it. Most people who pass through there every day have no idea. By 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was something that shouldn't have been possible in Jim Crow America. And maybe that's exactly why what happened next happened. Greenwood had its own hospital, its own law firms, its own newspapers, its own hotels and theaters and restaurants. The wealth that black Tulsans had built in Greenwood circulated within the community. A dollar was said to change hands 19 times before it left the neighborhood. People called it Black Wall Street, and that wasn't metaphor. It was a description. On the night of May 31, 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a white elevator operator. The charges were almost certainly false. The operator herself later declined to press them. But within hours, a white mob had gathered outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held, and when a group of black Tulsans arrived to help protect him, shots were fired. What followed over the next 18 hours was not a riot. The word riot implies chaos, implies two sides in mutual conflict. What happened in Greenwood was a coordinated assault. The National Guard was called in, and in some accounts, its members participated in the destruction rather than stopping it. Planes flew over the neighborhood. Eyewitness accounts, disputed but persistent, described gunfire from the air. More than 35 blocks were burned. Somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 homes were destroyed. The hospitals, the law offices, the hotels, gone. The official death toll was listed at around 36. Independent historians believe the actual number may have been as high as 300. The bodies were never all accounted for. Survivors were detained in internment camps set up around the city, and then Oklahoma removed the massacre from its public school curriculum, not acknowledging it in textbooks for decades. The Greenwood district was rebuilt by its residents. Rebuilt, largely without government assistance, through what can only be described as an act of collective will. That version of Greenwood was later dismantled again, this time by the construction of a highway through its center in the 1960s. The machinery of erasure didn't stop. It just changed its instruments. Every entry on this list has a name, a date, a record, however incomplete, something to point to and say, this was here. That's already more than most. Before the cities that were flooded, before the neighborhoods that were burned, before the towns that were contaminated and then designated uninhabitable, there were thousands of communities that European cartographers never placed on a map in the first place. Not because they didn't exist, but because placing them on a map would have required acknowledging that the land had people on it, that it wasn't empty, that it wasn't available. The Cherokee towns in the valleys of the Carolinas and Georgia, some of them with populations larger than contemporary colonial settlements, were erased first from European records, then from American memory, then from the physical landscape through a process that took about a century and involved systematic warfare, forced relocation, and legal structures specifically designed to make indigenous land tenure unrecognizable under American law. This isn't the story of one city. It's the architecture underlying all the other stories on this list. The logic that says some communities are legible and some aren't. That some losses get marked and some don't. That some histories get to be history and others get to be silence. What makes this the first entry, the foundational one? Isn't that it's the most dramatic case. It's that it's the template. The reason some of the later erasures were so easy to accomplish is that the template had already been established. That land could be cleared of its people, that cleared land could be called empty, and that empty land could be called opportunity. There's a version of history that gets told in straight lines. Cities grow, cities decline, cities disappear, natural processes, economic forces, the invisible hand. That version is easier. It doesn't ask much of you, but these 10 places don't fit that version. Not really. What they have in common isn't decay. It's decision. Somewhere behind each disappearance is a meeting, a policy, a night when a choice was made about whose presence mattered and whose didn't. Maps have always been political documents. What they include, what they label, what they leave blank, none of that is neutral, and the places that are missing from them aren't missing by accident. The question that stays with you after all of this isn't just about the past. It's about what's being decided right now, what's being built, what's being demolished, whose stories are being kept, and whose are being quietly, efficiently erased. Some of what was lost is gone forever, but some of it is still there, under the water, under the park, under the highway, waiting for someone to ask the right question.